Well, for more on that, we're now joined by activist, advocate and author of the book Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. We're joined by Advocate Ngcukaitobi. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the invitation.
So you must have been a very young boy when the Constitution was signed, and you probably didn't know you were going to be a lawyer one day. But now that you've lived through it and you've got chance to look back, how well did our forefathers do in putting it together?
Pretty well, by historical standards, by our own national standards and by global standards. Let me unpack that. By historical standards, I mean the idea of a constitutional state or the idea of constitutionalism is an old idea. It is probably now more than 100 years old. It's an idea that comes from the founders of the ANC, Pixley Isaac, Alfred Mangen, Richard Msimang. It runs through to the 1923 ANC Bill of Rights. It passes over to the 1943 ANC African Claims, which contained a full statement of the Bill of Rights. It permeates the Freedom Charter of 1955. You remember its opening statement: South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and no government can justify authority unless it is based on the will of the people. And then it consolidates in 1991 with the draft Bill of Rights produced by the ANC, and that it produces then the final product. So in historical terms, they did very well in keeping up with the historical mission of the ANC, which is to create a system based on constitutionalism. It also did well in international terms. If you look at the major international documents, the International Covenant on civil and political rights, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, you find many of those rights embedded in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. But also you find other ideas coming from France, from the UK, from America, from Canada. And particularly the most important idea coming from America is that the Constitution and the Constitutional Court are supreme in the sense that their word is final about what the Constitution means. Now, that's a very radical proposition which contradicts the sort of Westminster system where Parliament used to be supreme. They also did well in relation to the local sphere. Apartheid was a particularly egregiously awful system, and it was an immoral system, and the Constitution was then designed as an instrument to make us better people, to create morality in a sea of immorality. So yes, the people who negotiated, signed, fought for it, did pretty well.
And it has been tested quite a bit over time. Do you think that it has stood up to those tests and those challenges?
Yes, it has. Let us look at the structure of the Constitution. So many people argue that the most important part of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. And I think with perhaps some justification that the most important part is the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights, you must remember that it began as a claim of political entitlements, the idea of equality. If you stood up at Church Square in the middle of Pretoria in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was being established, and you asserted equality on racial lines, you probably would have been lynched. But the claim of equality was always a political claim, and the fact that we now have it as an enforceable right, it's in the law, which means that it's not just an indeterminate political claim, but it is something you can go to court and get translated. That entitlement has served the LGBTIQ community, which now has obtained substantial rights that in many comparable constitutions do not exist. But it is also a right that has enabled the opening up of many sectors of the economy to people that were previously excluded from those sectors of the economy. It's opened up educational institutions. It's opened up churches. So it's opened up an entire socio-cultural and economic sphere that was previously closed to people. So from that point of view, in other words, trying to realize the right to equality, it sort of stood up to the test. But you also have other elements to it, particularly the rule of law, which probably has been the most tested part. And the testing has come primarily from politicians who do not like the strictures of the Constitution, which hold political power accountable to a legal standard. You will remember, I think some 15 years ago, the ANC complaining that the judges are not consonant with the prevailing sort of national spirit, and that the judges are acting in conflict with the wishes of the people. So it's also produced this thing that is called a counter-majoritarian dilemma, whereby the judges have to implement the law regardless of the popular views and the popular narratives, and also regardless of what the wishes of the politicians are. And insofar as that issue is concerned, it's been severely tested. And in the Mandela era, it stood to the test of time. In the Mbeki era, it again stood the test of time. And of course, we saw particularly the trying period of the Constitution in the Zuma era, where the Constitution again stood the test of time. That, of course, is not to insulate the Constitution and project it as a perfect document. It has its imperfections. It has its limit. It has its constraints. And one of those has been its inability to solve the problem of racialized and gendered inequality.
All right, that's interesting you should say that, because I read an article recently by someone who calls himself Professor Balthazar. We don't know who he is in real life, but he writes something interesting. He says, it must be conceded that far too much constitutional writing was couched in legal fundamentalism without a careful consideration of the interface between politics and law. Does that speak to what you're saying just now?
Yes and no. I mean, I'll tell you what I mean by talking about the translation of political rights into legally enforceable instruments. I mean, the claims that are in the Constitution began as political claims. They all began as part and parcel of a larger political struggle. So equality is one of those. Even concepts like access to water or access to healthcare services, etc. So all of those began as political claims. And as political claims, they were uncertain. They were indeterminate. There was no way of guaranteeing that they would be enforced. What the Constitution did, and it is a most significant part, is that it translated them into legally enforceable rights. Now, and here is the point that Professor Balthazar makes, and I think that's your question. Now, what do they mean? What does it mean to have access to healthcare services? What does it mean to have access to housing? So remember that the Constitution doesn't say everyone has a right to a house. It doesn't say everyone has a right to go to a hospital and to be attended to, regardless of whether they can pay or not. But it talks of the language of access to housing or access to healthcare services. Now, what that means can be a highly contested and contestable idea. And that's where Professor Balthazar means when he says the framing is in legalese. What it means is that it's framed in a language that purports to be precise, but in reality it is imprecise. Now, the reason I do not agree with him is because there is no text anywhere in the world that provides clarity and precision that is incapable of different interpretations. That's the first problem. Even a concept like everyone has the right to life, it seems precise, but when you start debating whether or not it means that the government must provide everyone with food so that they don't die of hunger, or whether it simply means that the government should not kill anyone through the death penalty, or whether it means that the government should protect everyone from being killed by a stranger, then you see that even that concept can have so many different interpretations and shades of the same interpretation. So it's unrealistic to expect a text to bring about precision that takes it beyond the realm of contestation. And then the last thing about why I think that the phrasing is I do not agree with it, is that it's necessary for law to remain capable of interpretation so that it keeps up with societal development. What you do not want is a stale constitution whose language is so rigid that it cannot keep up with the developments in society. What you want in some is a living constitution.
Talking about a living constitution, for us lay people now, we have this constitution and we were always told you need a 2/3 majority to change it. It's unlikely that we'll ever see a party with a 2/3 majority ever again, maybe. One doesn't think so. So does that mean the constitution will never be changed, or will there be other legal remedies like the Constitutional Court that might look back and say, actually, we need to think this again?
The Constitution has, in fact, been changed 17 times.
Wow.
But it's largely been changes that are in the margins. So, for instance, the last big change to the Constitution was whether or not the Constitutional Court should be the apex court, or whether it should remain purely a court dealing with constitutional matters, or whether or not the position of Chief Justice should be the head of the judiciary. There was massive support for that. It passed through Parliament. It was a non-controversial clause. And so it was easy to get the 2/3 majority, even though the ANC itself did not have 2/3 majority, but there was general broad consensus among the members of Parliament. So I think that those clauses in the Constitution that do not tend to generate as much controversy as Section 25 did will probably continue to be subject to some sort of political consensus that enables the Constitution to change. Then on your specific question, when it comes to highly divisive and highly controversial matters, obviously it's going to be extremely difficult to change the Constitution. Let's ask ourselves, is that a bad thing? Probably not. Why? Because a constitution of a nation is that one instrument that keeps all of us together. It keeps us honest. It should not be easy to just change it at the drop of a hat. In this case, around Section 25, let's face it, there was no justification for the politicians to attack Section 25 for their own failures. The truth of the matter is that Section 25 was always a mandate for the genuine liberation of African people. It was always a mandate for land reform. It was always a mandate not to pay landowners payments that are excessive and consistent with market value. It expressly allowed the government to pay just and equitable compensation. But the government did the opposite. From 1997, it actually started paying landowners market-related compensation as part and parcel of its own policy. So in this sense, it was not a particularly bad idea that the politicians couldn't see eye to eye on an amendment that was a misguided idea to begin with. What should we be doing? I think that we should be looking at an expanded vision of the Constitution. One of the problems, and I think that's something, Peter, you've alluded to, one of the problems is that we've tended to leave the Constitution to a document of lawyers and judges. What we should be doing is to expand the Constitution to everyday language so that it belongs to all of us, so that it is not up to the courts to tell Parliament what it should do, but it is up to Parliament to lead the process of interpretation of the Constitution, so that it is also up to the executive to lead the process of the domestication of the Constitution into executive policy, so that in our everyday language, we speak the language of constitutionalism, so that it informs our own relations. I mean, one of the clauses that interest me in the Constitution, for instance, is Section 8, which says that the Constitution binds even individuals and private sector where, for instance, on issues like equality, you know that in the private sector you may not be discriminated. So the Constitution has both a horizontal and a vertical effect. But it's on the horizontal level that we have not done enough work to make sure that the Constitution is a document that essentially belongs to the people. It's bottom up. It doesn't belong to an elite group of lawyers and judges.
Okay, perhaps as a final question, I'm sure you've read the Constitution 100 times, backwards and forwards. Is there one area, one section that you think is so problematic it really needs to be addressed?
Oh yes, there are many parts to it, not just one. There are many parts to it. I think the one, if you look at and it's actually not even an innovative idea. If you look at the powers that are concentrated on the president, the powers concentrated on the president are too much and too many, and a lot of them unaccountable. Another area is the degree to which an institution like the NPA is independent from the Minister of Justice. Section 179 is a very ambiguous and a vague clause that you need that separation. And the third one is the fact that we don't have a dedicated, constitutionally dedicated anti-corruption structure. And in this country, one of the factors that are undermining the sustainability of the constitutional system is corruption. But we don't have a constitutionally established, for instance, Chapter 9 institution that focuses only on corruption. In many countries in Europe and in Africa, they do have dedicated anti-corruption commissions. So there are a number of clauses in the Constitution that one could look into and make it better. But even those clauses perhaps could be achieved by national legislation. So as I began, we are not in an imperfect world of constitutionalism, but we are in a world that is much better than where we were under apartheid, and much better than many other countries. That is why we are, in fact, an envy of the world. It was a person no less than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a judge of the American Supreme Court, who said, if she were to write a constitution now, she would look at the South African Constitution.
Wow. Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed. And perhaps when you're Chief Justice one day, you'll have a chance to influence some of these documents. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. Thank you.